Welcome to another edition of Back to the Basics, where we're still discussing the great deception. This is Elisha, your friend, your brother, and companion in the gospel. It is again an honor and a privilege to be able to come to you with the words of Yahuwah, the words of Yahusha HaMashiach. As always, it is my prayer that all who listens to this podcast will be gaining greater wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of the full truth. For you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make us free. With that in mind, let us pray. Heavenly Father, in the name of Yahuwah, we come thanking you for opening our eyes of our understanding that we may be enlightened. We thank you for leading and guiding us through your Ruach HaKodesh into all truths. Teach us to stand fast in the liberty wherewith you have made us free, and be not entangled again with yokes of bondage. Teach us to be bold as a lion, but yet harmless as a dove, as you reveal these truths to us. This is my prayer. In our last lesson, we discussed the Nazarene, betrayed, beaten, and begotten, part 4. With the subtopic, the leader of the Nazarenes. Today we will discuss part 5, Apostle Shaul or Paul, the leader of the Nazarenes and follower of Yahusha. We concluded the last lesson explaining the authority of James the Just, who was Yahusha's brother. He alone had the privilege of entering the Holy of Holies, since indeed he did not use wooden or woolen vestments, but linen, and went alone into the temple and prayed on behalf of the people, inasmuch as his knees were reputed to have acquired the hardness of camel's knees, because he had developed calluses on his knees for being on his knees so regularly. Since it was unlawful for any but the high priest of the temple to enter the holies of holies once a year on Yom Kippur, according to Jerome's quotations from Hezekiah, indicates that James was considered a high priest. The pseudo-Clementine recognitions suggest this. Shaul told us in his words to study to show thyself approved unto Yahuwah, workman that needs not to be ashamed, but rightly dividing the words of truth. If we're going to know the truth of Yahuwah's word, we must be hungry enough, thirsty enough. For scripture said, he that hunger and thirst after the righteousness of Yahuwah shall be filled. We must be willing to go a little deeper. Those who claim that Shaul is a false teacher are immature at best in their understanding of history and what Shaul taught, and to overcome the twisted Greek appropriate lie that is the Pauline doctrine. And we're going to talk a lot about the Pauline doctrine. If the Nazarenes accepted Shaul as their leader, then Shaul, which is Paul, must have been an outstanding champion of their cause, with unique understanding of the Torah and Messiah. So what does it mean to be a Nazarene? This is very important, because whatever that means, that is Shaul's and what he stood for, what he taught, what he promoted, and later what he died for. And it should be within that context because Christianity has a way of taking things out of context to make it relevant to fit the false religion. So whatever that means, that is what Shaul stood for, what he taught, what he promoted, and later what he died for. So it should be within that context that we understand his writings, not with the Hellenistic context that our English Bibles are written, twisting Shaul's letters into the Pauline doctrine based on Greek appropriate text. And we're going to talk about that a little later and break it down. Shaul was a Hebrew Nazarene, not a Roman Hellenized Christian like he's portrayed today. Remember, after Shaul was arrested in Jerusalem, he was escorted to Caesarea to appear before the governor. And that governor was Governor Felix, under the authority of Ananias, the unauthorized high priest. The meaning why he is saying unauthorized high priest is because the true Messiah was Jochanan, John the Baptist, in the wilderness. The grandson of Yahusha III, the Zodakite high priest. And all Jerusalem knew that John or Jochanan was the high priest in the desert, not the unauthorized high priest that Herod appointed. This is why Shaul separated himself from them and wanted nothing to do with the corrupt priest in the temple. Tertullus brought the charges before Felix. Now let's look at his accusation that he brought before in Maasium 24, 5 through 6. For we have found this man to be a pest and a mover of sedition among all the Yahudians or the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, not Christians, but a sect of the Nazarenes. 6th verse, who also have gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law, trying to make their case. So here we see a first-hand account and eyewitness testimony that Shaul, which we call Paul, was a Nazarene and a follower of Yahusha. Shaul was in fact the leader of the Nazarenes, having assumed that role at the death of James the Just, which is Yahusha's brother, in 62 AD. Shaul went on to make waves in Israel. Anytime you go against the grain, the traditions of men, you're going to make a lot of waves. But again, you must be bold as a lion, but yet harmless as a dove. So Shaul went on to make waves in Israel among the Yahudish or the Jewish leaders and Pharisees, just like Yahusha did, confronting them with the written Torah and overturning their traditions. Shaul was being tried for the exact same crime that Yahusha was put to death for. Shaul, like Yochanan, John the Baptist, and Yahusha, was the leading figure in defense of the written Torah, the prophets, and the Messiah. Why? Because he was, and they were, Nazarenes, after all, defenders of the Torah, defenders of the prophet, and defenders of the Messiah. Now, bring us to our lesson today, the emergence of the Nazarene under Shaul, the apostle. Initially, after Yahusha's death and later the stoning of Stephen, the Nazarene followers went into hiding, fearing they too would be rounded up and meet the same fate. Why were they running? Why were they hiding? Because of the Inquisition. But the Roman Catholic Church hunted them down like outlaws, killed them, had them fed to the lions in the arenas like sport. So they went into hiding in fear of the Inquisition. However, under the leadership of Shaul, the apostle, and the protection of Gamaliel in the Sanhedrin, which is Gamaliel was his mentor, his teacher, the greatest Pharisee ever lived. This was Shaul's teacher, the leader of the Sanhedrin, the greatest Pharisee, teacher of the law. The Nazarenes began to steadily grow in number in spite of their attacks, in spite of being fed to lions as sport. Instead of being in hiding, the Nazarenes began to steadily grow in number. They first began to emerge after Yahusha's execution following Shabbat, when Yahuwah breathed on or poured out his Ruach HaKodesh, his spirit, upon them. So they first began to emerge after Yahusha's execution, following Shabbat, when Yahuwah breathed on them, on the disciples. They began to teach in public arenas with much more confidence. Why? Because the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit, giving them a Ruach of comfort from the threat of death, known as the Comforter. The Nazarenes would steadily increase their numbers and eventually grow to be the dominant sect in Jerusalem. The turning point would be as a result of Shaul, a high-ranking Pharisee that was greatly respected in Jerusalem, converting to become a Nazarene. What a change of events. He went from hunting down the Nazarenes because he thought it was right. He was a Pharisee, a keeper of the law, a lawyer, until he was converted to become a Nazarene, follower of Yahusha. Let's look at Shaul's journey to accept Yahusha as his Messiah instead of his enemy. Shaul attacks James the Just on the temple steps. Shaul, Paul, as we all know, was a leading figure in persecuting the Nazarenes because he was a very prominent Pharisee and deeply dedicated to the preservation of the Torah, which he thought was under attack by this new sect called Nazarenes. It's amazing what we do without knowledge, just because it was handed down to us from generation to generation, until the Ruach HaKodesh of Yahuwah opens our eyes of our understanding. Shaul was present at Stephen's stoning, which later would haunt Shaul and most probably remain with him as a thorn in his side. Prior to the stoning of Stephen, while Caiaphas and his father-in-law Ananias were in control of the temple, there was a significant event that took place found in the historical records, but it's not recorded in the book of Meashim. It was this historical event that Shaul learned to highly respect James the Just, in whom he was attempting to kill on the temple steps. How did that happen? It is important to investigate another earlier event that is also not recorded in the book of Meashim, in which the leadership of the Nazarene ecclesia were challenged to a public debate with the temple leadership over the claim that Yahusha was the Messiah of the Yahudians, or the Jews. Thus, this debate was to take place on the interior temple steps in front of the population. The Nazarene leaders felt that this would be a good opportunity to present their message of the risen Messiah to the Yahudians in Jerusalem. They had now become bold, emboldened by the Ruach HaKodesh. Come out of hiding. This is a good opportunity for us to present the message of the risen Messiah. The account of this event virtually became extinct thanks to Christianity, whose goal is to hide the truth of Shaul and paint him as a false teacher. But what I found out over the years that the truth will always outrun a lie. You need not fight in these battles, for the battle is not yours, it is Yahuwah's. So the account of this event virtually became extinct, thanks to Christianity, whose goal is to hide the truth of Shaul, who he really was. But we're going to find out what they've been hiding. Except in the poorly preserved 4th century Latin translation by Rufinus of Aquileia of the 3rd century work, The Recognition of Clemens. The truth will always outrun the lie. Clemens was a disciple of Barnabas. Clemens later became the 3rd bishop of Rome that was dedicated by Kepha, Peter the apostle. His work mostly is unknown today, would be accepted as based on earlier manuscripts that was lost to antiquity, called the Preaching of Peter and the Ascents of Jacob. The recognitions of Clemens were preserved and recognized as writings of the Nazarenes of the Zadok Essen tradition called Ebionites and Nazarenes, or Nazarenes, which I explained earlier in the series. Let's look at the recognition of Clemens. Documents a very important timing point with both the Nazarenes and the man who would later rise in their ranks to lead them, defining the Nazarenes to this day. And that man was Shaul, the Pharisee. This event is the debate between James the Just, the brother of Yahusha and leader of the Nazarenes in Jerusalem, and Shaul, the Pharisee, on the steps of the temple. A very public debate that changed both men's lives, ultimately serving as the foundation of their mutual respect for one another and their close relationship. If you are sent by Yahweh, he will confirm it over time. You don't have to put up signs, put a title on your name. But if he call you, your gift will make room for you and bring you in the presence of mighty men. Let's look at this opening debate topics, which included emphasis on mikvah, which we call baptism, and self-sacrifice in opposition to physical animal sacrifices, placing Yahusha on the same level as Moses, as one of the greatest prophets. Attacking the teachings of Yahusha, which attracted the poor by offering earthly rewards and inheritances to those who maintain a righteous life. And charging Kepha, a man not officially educated in the Pharisaic schools in Jerusalem, as portraying himself as a teacher and using the title rabbi. Let's look at this public debate broke down when Kepha attacked the temple sacrificial system. Now, you're okay when you go along with the system, but when Yahuwah open your eyes and begin to show you falsehood in the system, that's when the attacks come. But the scripture tells us in the midst of the similitude, know that you have heard from Yahuwah. So it doesn't matter. If he told you to say it, say what he said say. Not what you want to say, but say what he told you to say. No more and no less. And you'll be fine. We have ascertained beyond doubt that Yahusha is much rather displeased with the sacrifice you offer. The time of sacrifices have now passed away, or have been transposed to the Ruach, or the Spirit, with Melchizedek. And because you will not admit that the time for offering animals, victims is past, or been transposed to self-sacrifice, because we are living sacrificial. We are in ourselves living sacrificial lambs in the Yahushiach covenant. Therefore, the temple will be destroyed, and the abomination of desolation shall stand in the holy place. Excuse me. That's better. So, let me say that again. We have ascertained beyond doubt that Yahusha is much rather displeased with the sacrifices you offer. The time of sacrifices having now passed away, or have been transposed to the Ruach with Melchizedek. And because you will not admit that the time of offering what? Animal victims is past, or been transposed to self-sacrifice, because we are indeed living sacrificial lambs in the Yahushua covenant. Therefore, the temple will be destroyed, and the abomination of desolation shall stand in the holy place. Let's look at a source. Schofield Hughes Joseph, The Pentecost Revolution, the story of Jesus in Israel, AD 36 through 66. McDonald and James, St. Giles, 49 to 50, Poland Street, 4950 Poland Street, London. WI 1974, page 126. This is what they wrote. It took the mediation of Gamaliel, the chief officer of the Sanhedrin, the highest Pharisee religious court, to stop the debate to be resumed the next day. This time limiting the debate to Gamaliel, representing the Sanhedrin, and James Jacob the Just, the son or the brother of Yahusha, our Messiah, representing the Nazarenes, not Christians, but the Nazarenes. This engaging debate raged for 7 days, in which at the end all the people, the high priest included, are ready to be mikvahd. The source, Schofield Hugh Joseph, The Pentecostal Revolution, the story of Jesus, party in Israel. AD 36 to 66, McDonald and James, St. Giles, 4950 Poland Street, London. 1974, page 127. This is what he wrote there. At that moment, in arrives an enemy, which Yahudish or Jewish historian Schofield identified as Shaul, the student of Gamaliel, who along with his supporters began harassing and reveling the priests, and eventually incited them to murder. With that, Shaul seized the firebrand from the altar and began to attack the Nazarenes. This was before his conversion. At that time, according to the assets of Jacob, as quoted in the recognition of Clements, the following accounts occurred. Much blood is shed. There's a confused fight or flight in the midst of which that enemy attacks. With Shaul and the other Yahudims attack James the Just. and threw him headlong from the top of the steps. Supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. But our friends lifted him up, for they were both more numerous and powerful than the others. But from fear of Yahuwah, they rather allowed themselves to be killed by an inferior force than they would kill others. But when the evening came, the priest shut up the temple, and we returned to Jacob, Peter's house, and spent the night there in prayer. Then, before daylight, we went down to Jericho to the numbers of 5,000 men. Remember, the Nazarenes have grown in number, even in the midst of the Inquisition. Another source, Accents of Jacob, quoted in the recognition of Clements, as quoted by Schoenfield, Hugh Joseph, the Pentecost Revolution, the story of Jesus, the same reference. It was Epiphanius accepting the historically of this event that was quoted in the Accents, who states this: they, the Ebionites, have other acts which they will call those of the apostles, in which are many things filled with their impiety, whence they have incidentally furnished themselves with arms against the truth. For they set forth certain accents and instructions, forsooth, in the accents of Jacob, representing him as holding forth against both temple and sacrifices, and against the fire on the altar, and many other things filled with empty talk, so that they were not ashamed in their event to denounce Shaul in certain invented or made up utterances of the malignant and deceitful work of their false apostles. People will go to great lengths to try and destroy you, but because Yahuwah sent you, it's impossible. It's another source, Epiphanius, Paranormal 30:16, quoted in Schoenfield, Hugh Joseph, the Pentecostal Revolution, the story of Jesus, same reference, page 128. Let us dissect this critical event in the early history of the Nazarene ecclesia very closely. Epiphanius was the first recognized church historian for the Roman Orthodox Church, who felt that the books, the recognition of Clements and the accents of James, represented books of heresy. Why? Because it exposes the lie that is told in the false religion. Later in the church history, all books of heresy were called Gnostics. But we must be careful to recognize that there were many competing ideologies and factions that were trying to gain control over the Yahudish or Jewish and later the Nazarene congregation, trying to infiltrate it. This is why Shaul said, if any man teach any other gospel other than the one that we brought to you, he said, let him be accursed. Because even back then, they were trying to infiltrate the assembly. Yet Epiphanius, as a historian, still recognized that religious texts of opposing ideologies did still give historical accounts Whether they accepted it or not, it still gave historical accounts that were valuable in understanding the growing ecclesia of the apostles in Jerusalem, called the Nazarenes. From every appearance, the writers of the Acts of Jacob did have a case against the apostle Shaul, who in his rash younger days did oppose and persecute the leaders of the Hebrew ecclesia of Nazarenes in Jerusalem. And he sought to kill James the Just during a debate in the temple against the leading rabbinic scholar in Jerusalem and the Begotten, the chief officer of the Sanhedrin, which was Gamaliel, the teacher and mentor of Shaul, the Pharisee. If this historic event is accepted even in part, then there was very personal relationship, though initially acrimonious, between Shaul and the apostle James the Just before Shaul's conversion. He thought he was doing the right thing because he was a Pharisee, the keeper of the law. There's a saying in regard to very close, intimate relationships. They are born first out of conflict, then change, leading to respect. Which brings us to the formula: intimacy equals conflict plus change. Relating this formula to the relationship of the Pharisee Shaul and the powerful oppositional high priest and leader of the Nazarenes ecclesia, James the Just. Both Rabbi Shaul and James the Just did have a very personal and intimate relationship. Yet there was truly conflict between these two opponents in the Yahudish or Jewish first century temple culture. James the Just was the leader of the Yahusha movement in Judea and the oppositional high priest or Nazai of the Hebrew Nazarene ecclesia of Israel, and also the zealot for the law of Moshe. Their main conflict was over the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Rabbi Yahusha. Fulfilled the Torah type and anti-type shadow pictures of the spring festivals as the son of Yahuwah, Abraham, and the Mashiach of the Yahudians or the Jews. Rabbi Shaul would later be the leading figure in the history to reveal the meaning of the very things he sought to destroy out of ignorance. The nemesis of the Nazarenes, Shaul, personally confronted James the Just and sought to destroy his life. It can be suggested that Rabbi Shaul, whom we know as Apostle Paul, owed something to Jacob, James the Just, in his prior attempt to take his life. For the Nazarene Nazar high priest, for James the Just to accept Shaul back into the fellowship of the Nazarenes, despite the prior attempts of Rabbi Shaul to kill him, says also something of the character of that man, James, Jacob, called the Tisadek, the Just. It might also fill in the blanks as to why the Apostle Shaul was so dutifully loyal to James the Just in their later years. As we shall later see, the opinion of many scholars that the Apostle Shaul and James the Just became close and personal friends. They disrespected each other for their positions as zealots of the law of Moses. Or they respected each other for their position of zealots of the law of Moses. This is the glue that brought them together. They both became fierce advocates for Yahusha. The brother of James was truly the promised redeemer of Israel. And they both gave their lives for allegiance to Yahusha, the Nazarene, who became the Messiah. That's a good place to shout. James lost his life by the hands of the same Sanhedrin families that sought to destroy his brother. Shaul lost his life at the hands of the Romans by the neurotic and half-crazed Emperor Nero, who pitted the forces of Rome against the zealots of Judea when Rome burned to the ground in 69 CE. Now let's look at Shaul emerges as the leader of the Nazarenes. What was the atmosphere in Jerusalem or Israel at the time of Shaul's ministry? What influenced Shaul, the apostle, leading to his acceptance of Yahusha as the Messiah? What brought that on? Excuse me. In Meashim, or Acts, we see Kepha, Peter, proclaim the gospel in Jerusalem. And 3,000 men were all Yahudish or Jewish. Not a Christian was among them. The Nazarenes were all Yahudish or Jewish. The proclamation continues in chapter 3 in the temple with Kepha, Peter, and Yochanan, John the Baptist, taking a center stage. They were witnesses that Yahuwah raised Yahusha from the dead. In Meashim, chapter 4. Kepha, Peter, and Yochanan, John the Baptist, are then arrested by the captain of the temple and the Sadducees because they were preaching the resurrection of Yahusha. At that same time, the number of the Nazarenes who believed in Yahusha had reached about 5,000. This meant that they outgrew the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, according to Josephus' numbers, who was a historian. The Nazarenes were now the largest and fastest growing sect in Jerusalem. Not one of them were a Christian. Not one of them were Greek pagans. They were all Yahudim, or Jews, who accepted Yahusha as the Messiah and were all to a man, not a demigod or Yahuwah in the flesh. They were all to a man, Torah observant. This is the true early assembly. It was in this environment that Shaul came to believe in Yahusha as well. The catalyst being Shaul's confrontation with James the Just. Shaul was a doctor of the law, which is what a Pharisee is, who studied under the most influential Yahudish or Jewish rabbi in history, Gamaliel. Gamaliel was such a respected figure during the time of Yahusha that he literally dictated the proceedings of the Sanhedrin. His authority was such that he even rivaled the authority of the high priest, as we read in Meashim, chapter 5. The epigram which rabbinic literature gives to him speaks of the respect with which Gamaliel was held. When he died, the honor or outward respect of the Torah ceased, and purity of the respect became extinct. Even the Yahudians, the Jews, admit that upon Gamaliel's death, the honor of the Torah ceased, or it succumbed to Hellenism, Greek appropriate wording, Greek appropriate lifestyle, and purity and piety became extinct, where it remains to this day in the form of rabbinical Judaism. From that point forward, history records that Judaism succumbed to Hellenization and paganism. So the Yahudians, or Jews, recognized Gamaliel's death as a defining moment when Judaism went astray. They took advantage from that day forward. Historically, we know that Gamaliel was an important Yahudish, a Jewish leader of the first century. And the New Testament confirms that he was part of the Sanhedrin, a doctor of the law, and was respected by the people. Like in the Mashiach of the apostles, records records all this along with the fact that he is a Pharisee of Shaul. To Lucas, the term Pharisee was descriptive and not necessarily written with negative connotation. For Shaul himself claimed to be a Pharisee in Meashim of the apostles. It was Shaul, being the protege of Gamaliel, that was instrumental in Shaul's rapid climb in influence and position within the ranks of the Pharisees. Gamaliel flourished then from about 20 AD to 52 AD. This was the period in which the assembly, or rather the Nazarenes, first grew into prominence. Because Gamaliel, being a converted as a Nazarene and the greatest Pharisee, he protected them while he lived. Gamaliel was a Nazar, head of the Pharisee in this period. During this period that Gamaliel headed up the party of the Pharisees, Yahusha said, the Pharisees sit in Moshe's seat. So all that they say to you, observe and do. Because he knew that they knew the law of Moshe. Since Gamaliel is said to have sit at the steps of the Temple Mount and issued letters from there, it is likely that he saw Yahusha in action and heard him teach, and perhaps even met and spoke with the Messiah on at least one occasion, if not many. Gamaliel later became the follower of the Messiah, and by all accounts, maintaining his position in the Sanhedrin. So he could use that position of authority to protect the Nazarenes from persecution, as we see him do in the book of Meashim. This is not admitted or even mentioned in rabbinical Judaism. We then see Shaul, an influential member of the sect of the Pharisees, become a believer and called by Yahusha to bring the gospel to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. What a turn of events that was scattering among the Gentile nations. It was a fellow Nazarene, described as an observant follower of the Torah, who came to restore Shaul's vision. It's amazing how Yahuwah will use your enemies to be your blessing. if you just wait. For the battle is not yours, it's Yahuwah's. Let's look at Meashim 22 and 12. Shaul going to a Torah observant, Yahudim Jew, to be healed. A man named Hananiah, an observant follower of the Torah. Why would he add that statement? Who was highly regarded by the entire Yahudish or Jewish community there, came to me and said, Brother Shaul, see again. Why do he need to see again? Because Yahuwah blinded on the road to Damascus, because he was on the way to Damascus to persecute the Nazarenes. But then Yahuwah turned around and sent a Nazarene to him to receive his sight. Can't nobody do that but Yahuwah. That's a good place to fight, to shout right there. We have Shaul's, Paul's teacher, a devout Torah observant, famous rabbi, the man who healed Shaul's, Paul's sight, all Torah observant Yahudims. In fact, there was no such thing as Christians that was among them at that time. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Nazarenes, and all of them were Torah observant Yahudims. This is the historical context of Saul's transition from being a leading Pharisee and persecutor of the Nazarenes to becoming a Nazarene, to being influential in the conversion of his rabbi Gamaliel to becoming a Nazarene, and finally later becoming the leader of the Nazarenes himself, which ultimately led to his own death. We have an environment where the leaders of the Pharisees, Gamaliel and Shaul, became converted to the Messiah Yahushua. And in Shaul's case, the leader of the entire Nazarene movement. Today, after 2,000 years of pagan Greek influence in translating the scriptures, Shaul's Nazarene teachings have been twisted into a Greek appropriate lie called the Pauline doctrine. Many so-called teachers today have proclaimed Shaul as a false teacher. This is because they themselves are self-appointed teachers, void of the Ruach or the Ruach HaKodesh, to teach them the truth of the letters that Shaul actually wrote. Excuse me. Since they cannot properly teach them his letters, they instead declare him a false teacher. So they are not exposed as very immature teachers at best, if not false teachers themselves who do not understand what they read. Any decision of Shaul, the apostle today, must come with a strong rebuke of those who would bear false witness against the most influential and anointed teacher of the Nazarene. That's a good place to shout, y'all. What these immature teachers are rebelling against is not Shaul's actual writings, but the Pauline doctrine of the Christian church, not the assembly of the Nazarenes, which is a soundbite driven doctrine that is born out of twisted, mistranslated texts. We always kick against what we don't understand. until Yahuwah opens your eyes. Then you can see clearly. This is a good place to stop. Join me for our next lesson. The Nazarene betrayed, beaten, and begotten, part 6. But we'll discuss the subtopic, Shaul, the Nazarene. If you're listening to this podcast, just know that we're in the hour of the Great Awakening, where Yahuwah is gathering back to himself the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Someone asked a question the other day, how do you know if I'm one of the lost sheep of the house of Israel? He said, I know that I love Yahuwah and the Torah, and I keep the Sabbath. I told him that is the very indication that you are one of the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because Yahuwah has written his laws on your heart. And when you hear the message of the law, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of Yahuwah quickens that truth that is in his law, that is written in your heart, that causes you to respond to the message of the law. After all, that's how Shaul identified the lost sheep of the house of Israel who were living among the Gentile nations in his day. Those Gentiles are lost sheep who was coming out of Syrian and Babylonian captivity, who had forgotten their identity. But the law of Yahuwah was written in their hearts, even while in captivity. And when they heard Shaul preaching the message of the law, the Ruach HaKodesh quickened the law that was written in their heart, and it came alive in their lives. And they recognized their identity as the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Remember, Yahushua was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, of whom Yahuwah had scattered into all Gentile nations, not the whole world. And let's be specific. The only nationality of people that have been scattered to every nation, according to Deuteronomy 28 chapter, is what is called today black people. Those people who had been enslaved over 400 years and oppressed even to this day. The lost sheep of the house of Israel. But there's another group of people that Yahuwah will identify and also receive an inheritance from those lost sheep of the house of Israel when they get into the kingdom of Yahuwah, are the Gentiles, the good stranger. This is the time when Yahuwah will flip the script, where the oppressor will become the oppressed, and the oppressed will become the oppressor. But when the good stranger, those that had joined themselves with Yisrael by humbling themselves and accepting the laws and ordinances of Yahuwah in their hearts, Yahuwah will accept them. So it is my prayer that this truth will reach all who will believe it, receive it, and live it. But to do that, you must be bold as a lion, but yet harmless as a dog. This is Elisha, your friend, your brother and companion in the gospel. Again, I want to thank all of you who have been listening to this podcast from day one. I know that Yahuwah have changed your life forever, just like he has done countless others, including my own. And if you are listening to this podcast for the very first time, I want you to know that it's not by happenstance that you found this podcast, but rather it was by divine appointment. You had questions that you needed answered. You've been searching for these answers because you hungered and thirst after the righteousness of Yahuwah. And he led you to this podcast. If that is you, I want you to hit that subscribe button so you can get all the lessons that you missed. And when you do subscribe, I want you to toggle all the way down to the very first lesson. And I want you to listen to each podcast in sequence. Don't skip around, because I want you to get the full impact of revelation that Yahuwah is going to impart into your life. Again, don't forget to leave your comments. Your comments are very important to me. I respond to each and every comment. Again, don't forget to share this podcast with your family and friends. Everyone needs to know the truth. And if you'd like to follow along with me in this series, I recommend you get this book, The Nazarene, Betrayed, Beaten, and Begotten by Rav Shaul. And Begotten by Rav Shaul. This is Elisha, your friend, your brother, and companion in the gospel. Until next time, be